in the land of Goshen. And he took 5 men from among his brothers and presented them to Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said to his brothers, "What is your occupation?" And they said to Pharaoh, "Your servants are shepherds, both we and also our fathers." And they said to Pharaoh, "We have come to dwell in the land because your servants have no pasture for their flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now therefore, please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen." Then Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, saying, "Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Have your father and brothers dwell in the best of the land. Let them dwell in the land of Goshen. And if you know any competent men among them, then make them chief herdsmen over my livestock." So ends the reading of the word. So Joseph, he's brought dignity. Believe it or not, he's brought dignity to the office of a politician. He knew how to get what he wanted because he was attuned to what others thought. He was careful of their blind spots and the prejudice that each person had, and he chose his words well. He's talking to Pharaoh here, and he's second in command over Egypt. He knew when to speak, and he knew when to hold his tongue. Unlike immoral politicians today. They're in it for themselves. They're in it according to what the polls say. They're in it to get payoffs from different countries. They don't care. I'm not just talking about America. I'm talking about politicians throughout history. Joseph is a unique person here. He is in a relationship with the God of Israel, and as we've seen throughout his life, it shows how he deals with his brothers, how he deals with people, and now he's in charge of Egypt, and he's watching over this famine. In verse 1, when it says, "Then Joseph went and told Pharaoh," so he's speaking to Pharaoh now, "and said, my father and my brothers, their flocks and their herds, and all that they possess have come from the land of Canaan. Indeed, they are in the land of Goshen." So he mentions Goshen. And he's doing it he's beginning to prepare Pharaoh's mind with his brother's request to dwell there as shepherds. Because remember, the Egyptians hated shepherds. They wouldn't allow not only shepherds, but actually the Israelites to eat at the same table. They separated them. But shepherds were even lower on the run. And so it took courage for Joseph to say, my brothers are shepherds. It was a menial task in the Egyptian's mind. But he's preparing his mind. And remember, he's not trying to manipulate anybody as most immoral politicians do. He's doing it from God's viewpoint. Because in verse 2 it says, "And he took 5 men from among his brothers and presented them to Pharaoh." Then Pharaoh, let me stop there for a minute. It says, "And he took 5 men from among his brothers." In the actual Hebrew, it's saying, "And from the extremity of his brothers, he took 5 men." And it's like a slogan or a phrase, meaning it's a random selection. He's taken it from the totality of all his brothers. He's taken 5, but he's not trying to pick out what 5. He just takes 5 randomly. Because think about it. Remember, where Joseph is filtering everything through the Lord, as we all should. He's born again. He's got a relationship with the God of Israel. Because he knows that if he chose the 5 strongest brothers, Pharaoh might take them and make them soldiers. If he chose the 5 weakest, he might be testing the Lord. He's so in tune with the Lord, he just picks 5 people, 5 of his brothers randomly, and presents them to Pharaoh. Because in verse 3 it says, "Then Pharaoh said to his brothers, 'What is your occupation?' And they said to Pharaoh, 'Your servants are shepherds, both we and also our fathers.'" So remember in verse 1, he's preparing Pharaoh's mind in the land of Goshen, where shepherds go. And now he's saying, here we go, is basically what Joseph's saying. I'm going to tell them that my brothers are shepherds. I know how they feel about shepherds. But he's not hiding the fact. He's trusting the Lord. And by not lying and trusting the Lord, now their means of living will become a wall of separation between them and the Egyptians. You see, it's easy for us, especially, I don't know so much about America, it's getting there in America, where if you stand up for the faith, you stand up for your convictions, what the Bible calls sin and what the world says is not sin, if you stand on your convictions, you're going to be persecuted for it. You may lose jobs, you're definitely going to lose friends, you're definitely probably going to lose promotions if you're working out there, because you stand on what the Bible says and what God says is sin, any type of lifestyle. And the world may say, no, it's not. Or how about this one? Jesus is the only way to salvation. That, to a lot of people, is hate speech. But so, in a way, Joseph knows how the Egyptians, but he doesn't know how Pharaoh is going to accept the fact that his brothers and they are families of shepherds. So, but because he's speaking the truth, because he's not afraid of man, because he's trusting in the Lord, what ends up happening is, because it's so easy for us to compromise with our culture. We have that temptation every day to compromise with the culture. But God, in his faithfulness to Joseph, he doesn't realize this yet, he's going to make a wall of separation between them and the Egyptians. He's going to isolate them, if you want to use that word, and they're not going to be so corrupted by the culture because they don't want to deal with shepherds. And actually Goshen's the best land of that day in Egypt. In verse 4 it says, and they said to Pharaoh, we have come to dwell in the land because your servants have no pasture for their flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now therefore, please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen. So in verse 4, the brothers ask if they can dwell, or it actually means dwell temporarily in the land of Egypt. And it reminds us of Genesis 15:13. Remember in Genesis, let me get that. Genesis 15:13, it says, Then he said to Abram, this is God saying to Abraham, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, that he will serve them and they will afflict them 400 years. Now he's revealing where this land is. It's Egypt, 400 years. And so we got to remember that the world's not our home, but we're only passing through it. And we should view all people, believers and non-believers, as temporary residents on earth. Because our final home, beloved, is either in heaven or hell. We're not going to stay here on earth forever. It's either heaven or hell. And so the appointment of some of Joseph's brothers to supervise the king's cattle means that they're going to enjoy legal protection not usually given to aliens. I mean, these were Israelites. You talk about racism. Racism's all around the whole world constantly since the beginning of time. And the Egyptians hated the Israelites, but now, because Pharaoh's well-disposed towards Joseph, and that's the Lord making him well-disposed, they're going to have legal protection. You know, as good citizens, we may enjoy legal protection. We do here in America, such as freedom to worship. We have freedom to worship right now, but don't be surprised if our legal protection is taken away at some point. That's going to happen. It's happened in a lot of countries around the world, always has been. But it's probably going to happen in America. But it was a sign of God's favor that Pharaoh was not offended when they asked for a separate place to live. Because what does it say in Proverbs 21:1? One of my favorite verses. The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he wishes. The king's heart, the president's heart, the congressman's heart, the monarchy in England's heart is in the Lord's hands, and he turns it wherever he wishes. God's in control, not man. In verses 7 through, a lot of it's judgments why we don't want to accept it. In verses 7 through 12 it says, then Joseph brought in his father Jacob and set him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Jacob, how old are you? And Jacob said to Pharaoh, the days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage. So Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from before Pharaoh. And Joseph situated his father and his brothers, and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded. Then Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with bread, according to the number in their families. So ends the reading of the word. So whatever character, let's say character, that may rule over us, if it's a good character towards Christians or a bad character towards Christians, we're commanded in the scripture in 1 Timothy chapter 2 to offer public prayers for them. I mean, there's been some wicked rulers, Hitler for one, Stalin for one. Do you think that Christians were commanded to pray for their well-being? To a certain point they were. Nero, when Paul gave that admonition in Romans 13, Nero was on the throne killing Christians. And that's when Paul said, pray for the leaders, for the safety of people. Now in verse 7, when he says, then Joseph brought in his father Jacob and set him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. See, it's in that same way, in verse 7, Jacob prescribed the rule that his countrymen should pray for the peace of Babylon as long as they were in exile, back in Jeremiah 29:7. See, Jeremiah says, pray while you're in captivity for the well-being of Babylon, because you're living in Babylon. But Jeremiah is also the place where, and we'll see this in Daniel, when Daniel was searching out the records and knew the 70 years was up. And so he knew that the Medes and Persians were going to come over and take over Babylon. He said, now it's time to pray for the Babylon's captivity, all because Jeremiah prophesied it. But in verse 8, I like verse 8, because in verse 8 it says, Pharaoh said to Jacob, how old are you? Not so much that one yet. Pharaoh's question to Jacob's sons had to do with their occupation, okay? So Pharaoh's question to Jacob has to do with age. How old are you? So, because he knows that occupation passes from father to son. So that's why he didn't ask his job. He said, my brothers, let them live in the land of Goshen, they're shepherds. And Jacob's saying, and Pharaoh's saying to Jacob, how old are you? I'm 130, the next verse, I'm 130 years old. So he knew they were been shepherds for a long time. But it's in verse 9 that I like. But before we get there, we have to, when we identify ourselves as Christians, just like Jacob's identifying himself as shepherds who were despised in Egypt, you know, we have a witness of 2,000 years, good or bad, as Christians. And our identity in the world is the reputation of the body of Christ. Because they're going to use, how many times have you heard what religion's what's caused all the wars. Religion's what's caused the witch trials, and on and on and on. You hear that all the time. There's answers to that given, but the thing is, our reputation is based on Christians that have gone before us, good or bad. In verse 9 is what I like. And Jacob said to Pharaoh, the days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers, and the days of their pilgrimage. So anyone living in that time beyond 110 years in Egypt was considered to have a blessed life. Okay? Jacob at this point is 130. This is another reason why Pharaoh is asking about his age. And he's saying, my life has been difficult. Now, you've heard me say this over and over, but it's true here. And this is where where you get the principle. Jacob's, what he's saying is, the closer we come to Christ, the more sin we see in ourselves. So Jacob's saying, my years have been difficult. I haven't been this great religious person, because he had an intimate relationship with the God of Israel. And I'm just telling you, that should be our response. When you come closer to Christ, the more sin you see in yourself. It's the person that walks around saying how special they are to God, how much they've done for God, that they're probably an immature Christian. Because Billy Graham's the one that said it. The closer you come to Christ, the more sin you see in yourself, the more humble you should be. You know, the world values what you're worth when you die. Now, I'm not going to mention the name, but there was a musician who was dying of AIDS at the age of 41. You wouldn't know who he was. And he weighed over 400 pounds. And the reason he weighed over 400 pounds dying from AIDS doesn't make sense, is he had a medical issue also. It's been a life of drugs that he's had, but he was very, very popular. The band is one of the most popular bands in the land, and he had millions of dollars, all the fame. And this is what he said. He said, "I am not a fat slob, so don't feel sorry for me because of the way I look and dying at such a young age, because I have lived a lifestyle people could only dream of, being a rock star." And he meant it. He literally meant it. Don't feel sorry for me. And I'm telling you, the poorest Christian that's living in Calcutta, India right now, that knows Jesus Christ, that has no home, that's probably living in the gutters, whatever it is, with sewer running by him, is in a better place than that musician that's worth millions of dollars, that in his mind lived like a Roman emperor. Because guess where he's at right now? Are we jealous of that? Are we jealous of movie stars having all that money and all that fame and living the lifestyle they actually think people are jealous of their lifestyles. They haven't met true Christians. You know, Joseph's celebrating the goodness of God towards those who went before him is what he's saying also. So he's not so much deploring his life, saying, "I've had a horrible life," but he's rather pointing to others throughout history. But he's saying, my 130 years has been a difficult life. I should have been a better believer in the Lord. I shouldn't have been so deceitful like my name means. But you know, in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 13 through 16, you'll recognize these verses. Hebrews chapter 11, 13 through 16 says, "These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. But now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them." You know, what does it say in Matthew chapter 10, 32 and 33? "Who's ever ashamed of me and my words, the Father will be ashamed of him on the day of judgment. Whoever confesses me before men, him I will confess before my Father who's in heaven. Those who deny me before men, I will deny before the Father in heaven." That's what Jesus says. You know, and I don't know, it's, we're not ashamed of being a Christian, no matter how bad it's going to get in this culture. In verse 10, here's the other thing, let me say this really fast. I just now thought of another guitarist back in the 70s that it's one of my favorite bands actually. But anyway, that's a different story. He played bass guitar is what he played. And on his deathbed, when he was dying, he said, "Oh Lord Jesus, what have I done? What have I done?" He kept repeating that. Maybe he was saved, maybe he wasn't, but what he was saying is, I've just wasted my life living like a rock star. And this music's going to keep going on. What have I done? In verse 10, it says, "So Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from before Pharaoh." So now here comes the conviction for all of us. If I'm convicted, you guys have to be convicted. You know the principle, it's an easy principle to see. Are we a blessing to our neighbors? to our family in Christ, to all those we cross paths in the world. I mean, look at verse 10. So Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Do we bring a blessing into people's lives when we meet them? You know, the biggest blessing you can bring to anybody is by talking about Christ, talking about faith, talking about heaven. That's a blessing. In verse 11 and 12, it says, and Joseph situated his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, and the best of the land in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded. Then Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with bread, according to the number in their families. So Abraham and Jacob, remember Abraham's life, they both sought out safety of Egypt during a famine. And to save himself, remember, go back to Abraham, he engages in deceit. Sylvia brought up, she meant to say Exodus 20, but she said Genesis 20, and I'm thinking in my mind, that's where Abimelech confronted Abraham and said, you lied to me, you said that Sarah was your sister. When God sent all those plagues on, Abraham would tell his wife twice, tell them you're my sister so they don't kill me. And God had to intervene. So Abraham, and so was Isaac, all of us at some point, engaged in deceit. But now Jacob, in order to save his family, engages in blessing with Pharaoh. But let me read 13 through 26. It says, now there was no bread in all the land, for the famine was very severe. So that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan, for the grain which they bought, and Joseph brought their money into Pharaoh's house. So when the money failed in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, give us bread, for why should we die in your presence? For the money has failed. Then Joseph said, give your livestock, and I will give you bread for your livestock, if the money is gone. So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them bread in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the cattle, the herds, and for the donkeys. Thus he fed them with bread in exchange for all their livestock that year. When that year had ended, they came to him the next year and said to him, we will not hide from my lord that our money is gone. My lord also has our herds of livestock. There is nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our lands. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for bread, and we and our land will be servants of Pharaoh. Give us seed, that we may live and not die, that the land may not be desolate. Then Joseph brought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. For every man of the Egyptians sold his field, because the famine was severe upon them. So the land became Pharaoh's. And as for the people, he moved them into the cities from one end of the borders of Egypt to the other end. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had rations allotted to them by Pharaoh, and they ate their rations which Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their lands. Then Joseph said to the people, indeed, I have bought you and your land this day for Pharaoh. Look, here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land. And it shall come to pass in the harvest that you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh. 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field and for your food for those of your households, and as food for your little ones. So they said, you have saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's servants. And Joseph made a law over the land of Egypt to this day, that Pharaoh should have 1/5, except for the land of the priests only, which did not become Pharaoh's. So ends the reading of the word. You know, really fast on this principle in these 13 verses, I guarantee you they were fortunate to have a believer in charge of what was going on during the famine. Majority of, I'll say, immoral politicians that would be harsh on people. But Joseph was actually gracious. You see, those who, just replace yourself with those people going through this famine. Those who trust in riches and wisdom should fear, because God is able to bring a famine and take away all your wealth in which you believed you earned. God can take that away at any time. Yeah, I just read this morning, don't have time to read it now, but you go to Deuteronomy chapter 8. In the last several verses of Deuteronomy chapter 8, when God is saying, you think you earned this yourself. You think you garnered all this wealth yourself. I'll just read it. Starting at verse 17, Deuteronomy chapter 8, 17. Then you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gained me this wealth. And you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant which he swore to your fathers as it is this day. Then it shall be, if you by any means forget the Lord your God and follow other gods and serve them and worship them, I testify you this day that you shall surely perish. In other words, he's saying, you think you gained all this wealth out of your own power, wisdom, intelligence, I made some good investment. God can take that away anytime he wants. He's doing this to Egypt. He's doing this to all those nations around Egypt. He's taking away all their wealth. But look what Joseph does. He doesn't take anything for himself. He gives all the money to Pharaoh. There were no side deals. Think of politicians today. No payoffs. They've done that the whole time. And how does somebody make 150, 200 grand and end up retiring 4, 8, 12 years later with 300 million?
Yeah.
The people are in so much famine straits here, they give up their money, their livestock, and eventually their farmlands and their own freedom in order to survive this famine. They give everything to the Pharaoh. You see, there's a time when you're living in security, you don't really think about the Lord. But when that day happens and you're going through something like this and everything's being taken away from you, you start seeking the Lord. But it's a blessing for these people to lose everything, even their free. I'll tell you why, because now they're focused on heaven. They're focused on not so much of this life anymore. They should be fortunate they have a believing person that's in charge of this. Because you know what? Both believer and non-believer, everybody in this room has suffered death in the family. They're no more. They're not here anymore. Both believer and non-believer are eventually lose all of our possessions that we've stored up on earth upon their death. It's going to happen, beloved. My brother in the service, when he taught, he said, the Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. That's 100% true. But I'll finish up with verses 27 through 31. It says, so Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the country of Goshen. And they had possessions there, and gave and multiplied exceedingly, and grew and multiplied exceedingly. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the length of Jacob's life was 147 years. When the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, now if I found favor in your sight, please put your hand under my thigh, and deal kindly and truly with me. Please do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. You shall carry me out of Egypt and bury me in the burial place. And he said, I will do as you have said. Then he said, swear to me. And he swore to him. So Israel bowed himself on the head of the bed. So ends the reading of the word. So verse 27 reminds us that we're aliens in a strange land. And even though we might be surrounded by famine and hard circumstances, we're blessed by God. Just always remember that, beloved. You have an intimate, personal relationship with Jesus Christ. No matter how bad it gets here, you've been blessed. You're going home eventually. See, neither geography, where you were born, nor natural catastrophe, pandemic, earthquakes, whatever, can thwart God's purpose, will, and commitment to his own sheep. Now, it's only going to get us to heaven faster. There was a guy, I remember really fast, smoked a lot, you know, and he came to church and rode up on his Harley Davidson. This was like 20, 25 years ago, smoking. He's talking to the pastor, Nathan. He says, "You probably really hate that I'm smoking here." Is he smoking right? Nathan, "No, it's just going to get you to heaven sooner." And it's true. It's true. Anyway, I'll just finish with this. We should desire to leave marks of our faith with those that the Lord brings into our lives, especially after God has taken us home. This is what Jacob is doing here. He's a blessing to Pharaoh. He's a blessing to his kids, to his family. And so everything that comes to us in this life, whether regarded as good or evil, it's meant to prosper us and reveal God's holiness, faithfulness, and love. Everything that happens to you, and you're going to know it when you get home.